Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Writerly Life Conversations. Today, I have with me Shrayana Bhattacharya, whose book, Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh, India's Lonely Young Women and the Search for Intimacy and Independence, is, on every bestsellers list. Welcome, Shrayana.
Thank you so much, Saurabh. And it's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you. I have to start by saying that you wrote such a warm and thoughtful review of the book. So thank you very much for that. And thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you. Shreyana, I wanted to ask you the first sentence is, my life has always been heteronormative hell. I wanted to know from you, what a powerful statement to begin with. Because at once you are presenting yourself as a vulnerable person, but also there is a sense of acknowledging the privilege that you have as a cishet woman. These both things come out very, illuminatingly in that line. I wanted to know, was there any alternate beginning you had in mind, or were you fixated on this sentence?
I was fixated on the sentence. It came to me, the preface, Saurabh, actually, I wrote last. There was a version of the first chapter, actually, originally, which, if you see now, is a composite. It's a sort of fictionalized composite of stories of 5 women, which is the first chapter in the book. And before that, there's the preface. And the line that you mentioned is the starting line of the preface. Originally, actually, some bits from the preface were in the first chapter. But then the pandemic hit, and actually, I lost someone very close to me who I used to discuss these things with him a lot. And, I think all of us have been through so much bereavement, right, through the pandemic. And I felt, I don't know, it was around that time, I'm going to say maybe July 2020, actually, when I decided that I wanted to redo the first chapter, that I wanted it to have a preface, that I wanted to acknowledge the pandemic. By then, I had also realized that some of the women I had been following, they were willing to share some pandemic stories, not a lot, but some. It was also very early. And so I decided to write this preface. And when I wrote the preface, I don't know, the first line, it was like this inner sense of anguish and reflection that I realized if I took a step back and I thought, why did I write this book? I think I wrote this book because almost every woman across class, caste, privileges, and challenges that I met through the course of research of the book is trapped in this kind of heteronormative cycle. And I think, in a way, the yearning for this idealized masculine, right, this very fantastical lover comes from that trap. And I felt that I had to acknowledge it. And so then I thought, well, what's the best way to acknowledge it but to acknowledge the fact that this book is born of that hell. And I didn't think when I was writing that line that I was acknowledging my privilege in any way, to be honest, because there are sections later that do. But it's interesting to hear you say that. But I just wanted to acknowledge that the book came from that hell, that I knew it wasn't just me, that it was a shared sisterhood. And perhaps actually of not just a sisterhood, but actually a community of lots of people who were feeling the same way. And I just wanted to give voice to that. I had no other line. In fact, my editor suggested a mild edit to it, and I just didn't accept it. I accepted most of his edits. Shaukat Dasgupta, he was the editor for the book. But I remember that one line is very dear to me. I would not change it.
First of all, Shreyana, why seek Shah Rukh when you're plotting desires and locating instances of gendered violence? Why seek Shah Rukh?
I think, as social scientists, I mean, my training is in economics, but I'm also trained in other disciplines. So I'll call it social science broadly. I think sometimes we do a great disservice when the only way we want to talk to other people, be it people we are investigating from our own class backgrounds, but particularly people who don't have the privileges of the person who is doing the research, right? Like other, people who are not as secure and safe as us economically, socially, culturally, all of that. I think sometimes we do a huge disservice to the community that we are trying to study by only boxing them and their lives in the frameworks of deprivation, poverty, and data, right? And data in that very numeric, codified sense. And I wanted to tell a story about gender, but I wanted through a set of accidents that I describe in the book, I wanted to come at the conversation on gender relations, but through pleasure and through fun. I really wanted the people I was talking to feel somewhat lighthearted when they were talking to me. It would go down very deep and tragic paths. I mean, some of the stories, even when I wrote them, there were tears in my eyes. And I know people have interacted with them in a certain way. They're not really light stories. But I think we started on this path of conversation with each other on a light note. And I think Shah Rukh allowed for that because, when I think people, all of us as human beings, were coded to want to tell our stories. We want to be understood. We want to convey our experience. But I think we do a disservice if we say, well, no, you only convey your experience telling me what, your deprivations are. I want to know what your desires are. I want to know what gives you pleasure, what makes you laugh, like what makes you come alive. And it just so happened that the women I met, people could use another device, right? To use that phrase, a research device or a literary device. People could use cricket. People have used cricket. If you think about the works of even like the greats of nonfiction, like Ram Guha, I'm thinking of, or, several others, people springboard into the lives of others using very different platforms, right? I just happened to use Shah Rukh because I love him and all these women loved him. And it just sort of felt much easier to talk about him and through him enter these conversations. So I think seeking Shah Rukh because I was seeking a very different way of approaching the research. And I have to confess, it happened by accident. I don't think I sort of set up to do it this way. It just so happened that I was very young. I was meeting people who would come alive, be it in slums, villages, posh neighborhoods in Delhi, when they want to talk about Shah Rukh Khan, as opposed to other, very straightforward social science questions about labor struggles. And then I realized when I followed through on that Shah Rukh story, it just opened up very different avenues of conversation. So I think seeking Shah Rukh because I was seeking to do a different kind of social science, perhaps, which others do as well. I think I wanted to sort of follow that path as opposed to a more traditional method.
This book is a culmination of 10 years of research. I want to know if you are aware or if you can find out from all these years a particular precise moment when you thought that these stories need to be told.
That's a hard one because I kept going back and forth. I'll tell you. So actually, the first set of respondents or people I follow was the people I call the woman I call Zahira in the book and Manju in the book. Actually, Manju calls herself Manju. Zahira is a name I came up with and the lady agreed. And of course, people have to read to know why Manju picks Manju. There's a story there. It happened between 2006 to 2007 when I met these women. It was that period. I met the accountant, I'm going to say maybe in 2008, 2009, again, when I was working at the Delhi Secretariat. And originally, Saurabh, because I was working for a feminist think tank and I had very encouraging mentors. I mean, I think this book is a culmination, not just of, 10 or 12 years, whatever research, but I think of sustained mentorship and support I've had from so many women, particularly feminists I've worked with, starting with people like Naila Kabir and Ratna Sudarshan. I was hired by this think tank called the Institute of Social Studies Trust. I'd gone through these surveys, I'd come back and met these women, Zahira, Manju, others, and I was telling Ratna about what I had seen, about how they were saving money to organize screenings. And I knew there was something very interesting going on in the way women were exercising their economic power, right, for their own fun, to claim fun for themselves. And, she said, why don't you write it up? And originally I thought I was going to write it up just as a small academic paper. I was writing a paper on the worker struggle and agitation in Ahmedabad for home-based workers, particularly looking at that time at incense stick workers. That became an academic paper. It was released in the Asian Journal of Women's Studies. But I knew that was not enough. There was something else going on. And so I thought originally it was going to be a very scholarly, somewhat traditional feminist piece on women claiming pleasure and how they save money and how they were organizing the screenings, looking only actually in the community in Rampur, which is Manju and her friends. And that was the plan. I was talking to a feminist publisher as well, actually, then when the paper became a bit longer. And sometime in 2012, sort of, by then I'd met all these other women. I'd met, a woman who is gold in the book, and the accountant, and several others. My own life had also reached a certain precipice in 2013, which I talk about. And I think at that time, I just realized I was going through something personally, which I'm quite transparent about. Nothing like heartbreak, like pushes you to think through some of these decisions again. And I realized actually, if I, in this moment, wanted to read a book, I don't know whether I wanted to read a book which would be scholarly. I would probably want to read a book that felt a lot more personal, that felt a lot more like the writing of the women I was reading at that time, people like Vivian Gornick, for instance. And so I decided, let me change this. And I decided in 2013, then this would no longer be just about the women in Rampur. It would open up to all the women. I then started contacting all of them, which I actually outline in the book, through a very messy process. I also realized then in 2013, around that period, that I wanted to open it up to women from my own class group. So I tried to actually recruit people who would be willing to talk to me in an anonymous way. And I think it was around 2014-15 when all of this was going on that I felt, okay, I think there's enough material here for it to be almost like a cross-class book. But honestly, Saurabh, the way it looks now, if you took me back to the version of myself in 2015 who was sort of pulling all of this together, I don't think I would have, I now recognize actually the book does have a scale and an ambition. It is trying to sort of tell you an intimate history of what women have experienced in post-liberalization India. I didn't think at all I was writing that book. I thought I was writing a very focused book on just how women see Shah Rukh. But I think as I started to write and rewrite in particular, I realized that this book was actually, it had the sort of space and the stories to do something very different. And by then I think had gained an appetite for risk. Because I thought, well, I'm not a full-time writer. I have a job. I have the privilege and certainty of like a life outside, right? I thought, you know what? Let's just go for it, and let's go for the jugular. Let's just do whatever I want to do creatively that makes me happy. And as long as it doesn't violate someone else's, personhood and makes them feel safe, like the privacy concerns and all of that, I thought, let's just do this. And and so I actually think that the version the book looks right now, I think it was only around 2019 when Shruti Devi, my agent, read the first draft, that she said, well, this book it can actually combine economics, sociology, all of these strands in a way that I hadn't actually even thought earlier that I was able to do. So I think I've had different versions of the book, Saurabh, through multiple periods of time, because it has taken me a long time to put it all together. But I would say, I think that period of 2013-12 was a very seminal moment when I decided that I wanted to change the way thinking about the book.
One of your works was 11 Ways to Love, an anthology, right? It's the same essay, right? That's there.
Yeah, in fact, that was when as I still actually hesitate to call myself a writer. I can't do it. It's in fact, a lot of people who know me make fun of me for it. So I was just about to hesitate in saying, as a writer, and then I realized, no, but I'm not a writer. So, but anyway, in one's writing career, as one is writing, I think we all need, particularly for those of us who don't come from, I don't come from journalism. I don't come from a community of peers who are involved in a kind of creative writing pursuit, right? I didn't go to a creative writing program. I don't come from that world at all. I'm a reader. That's actually what I think my principal identity is, still one of a reader. And so I decided that Shaugat Dasgupta, who eventually actually ended up editing the book, was at Indian Quarterly. And he said, Shrayana, he'd seen some bits of the book as I had sort of started to reshape it and make it more personal. And he knew actually the Aristocrat story inside out, because he'd seen me. We used to live in the same neighborhood. He knew what was going on. And he said, I really think if we're doing an issue on class, will you give me that excerpt? Like, can you give me some, like just a short piece? And I thought, well, you know what? This would be a good way to just gauge reaction. I was writing it very differently. So I gave him the piece, and it went, as I think the kids call it, viral. I mean, even Shashi Tharoor, I think, tweeted it out. And as a consequence, I think lots of people read it. And then Penguin at that time was doing an anthology for, I think it was like their idea of love. So this was 11 Ways of Love, different ways of thinking about love. identity and love. And but to me, honestly, now when I look at the book, I feel like that book is more about identity than it is about love per se. But like, I think it was very interesting the way they were doing it. And so Mansi Subramaniam, who was putting the book together, she said, "Do you want to just give me an expanded version of that essay?" And I said, "Sure." So that's 11 Ways to Love. It is now, it's called the Aristocrats in India Quarterly and in 11 Ways to Love. But actually, the chapter is an actor and an aristocrat, and you see it in the book. So it's an excerpt from Desperately Seeking Shah Rukh. And I'm so glad that I did, because it was good to get that feedback, right? To go through that process, because I had never been through it before. Just to gauge how people were engaging with it. And it helped me, it boosted my confidence a lot that, okay, I can, perhaps someone will read it. And, there's a method to this madness. And so, yeah, that's how that happened.
I could sense, I mean, I could see a lot of me in that, because I guess when I picked this book up, that was the time when I actually started dating men, and and this particular guy from Kailash Community was the exact same person, the way you're describing this, you know. So
Wow, it's
it was really,
amazing.
yeah.
It's amazing actually to hear you say this. You know why? Because so many men have written to me saying for some reason the chapter on the aristocrat and the chapter on gold, those
I was
two.
about to ask this. Gold, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of really, I think actually a lot of pretty gay men have written to me saying that chapter is about me, which is lovely,
True.
right? Like it's actually,
100% true.
I in a way made me so happy that, I was writing and I acknowledged it very transparently in the book. It does have a very hetero gaze, the book, because as I write from the first line, I want to sort of actually tell everyone that I actually have a line in the book which is, we're all trapped by heterosexuality. And but it was lovely to see that I think even people who are not trapped by heterosexuality were engaging with the characters and could identify with them, which felt really nice to hear.
A lot of what we are, who we are in this process of, uh, finding love, or being with this the one, right? And it's the idea of the one that is more suffocating actually, rather than liberating than we imagine it to be when we are in love. In what ways do you think that we do the fantastical when we are in love, and this hysteria that, I mean, we are overcome by this hysteria that we desperately want to be with that one, but actually when we lose this person, it's a time when we're truly liberated. And I also saw that this story was a story of liberation, so I wanted to know what that story meant to you.
Yeah, Saurabh, I have to say that I think for me, the reason I was able to write the book I've tried to be somewhat clear-eyed and not judgmental. Those were like two things were very important to me. I think the process of writing the book, and I think it's also a process of me growing up, right? Because it's 15 years I've grown up. I went from a person in my 20s to being in my mid-30s by the time the book was really like a consolidated thing. And I think, you let go of being very judgmental as you move through that process, because you realize life is really complex and people are never actually what they seem. And I think the one thing I was trying to do was to say that I don't think I would have been able to write this book had it not been for all the heartbreak and the letting go. So this liberation, even for myself, like in a way, the book is an act of liberation for me. I decided to liberate myself, not just from, I think, that mating market trap. Like I'm not interested in that game. I'm interested in love, but I'm not interested in that game. There's a game there, and I describe it in particularly goals chapter. I think is very indicative of that. And I also liberated myself from the idea that I wanted it to be like, I wanted to just write the book that I wanted to write. And I think there's a liberation in just owning that voice, right? Like your own. And I think any experience, good or bad, that can get you there is great, as long as it's obviously not debilitating, which some experiences can be. And I I think so. That's one thing, which is that I actually think that I actually write in the book and I talk about Kabhi Haan Kabhi Na because she was so obsessed with that movie and I love that movie. Which is that I think there's a lot of valor actually in that kind of heartbreak and letting go, right? Maybe all of us don't need to be with Juhi Chawla at the end, but even being on your own on the footpath and like hugging your own saxophone is pretty cool, I think. And so I really believe that I think there's a lot of power in embracing those experiences, provided you truly allow yourself to feel them and you truly embrace them and work them through, as opposed to, I think we are in this culture which like tells everyone, oh, you need to be cool about it and like be dismissive. And even in your heartbreak, you're supposed to show that, I'm so stoic and I'm so together. I'm not interested in that. Like all this stoicism and, I'm not interested in that. I think it's very fake. It doesn't interest me at all. I find it very boring. What I am interested in is, I think when people own their own discomfort and their own heartbreak and really ask themselves very tough questions about what is underpinning the desires for that one. And, in particular, I'm thinking also now recently of the work of Mia Srinivasan. I think she comes at it much more philosophically, where she says, we should take a step back and think about what underpins our desires. And I think, in fact, funnily, this book is almost like, if her book is like the theory, I feel like this is like illustration, because the book is actually full of people who are struggling with precisely that, to think about why is it that I've been socialized to want this kind of person. And in real life, even if I am with that kind of person, I'm not happy. And if I'm not with that kind of person, then I'm unhappy. And then I'm wondering why, what's the gap, right? And I think, to me, the real liberation is actually take a step back and think very hard and critically about our own sexual preferences, our own romantic preferences. Where do they come from? What is the sort of genesis of them? And I think that requires a lot of, so that's the real liberation. I think the second thing I will say, which is a theme running through the book when it comes to love, is that we've just set up now a kind of economic structure where loving yourself and loving your own preferences, I don't like those terms, self-love and all of that. I just think that they're too voguish, too trendy. I hate things that are on trend, and I don't like those terms at all. But I think when I say loving yourself, I just mean being comfortable with, your body, what you want to sort of achieve, what you don't want to achieve, that you want to just sit at home and read. I mean, all of those things, right? There are things that give us pleasure, each one of us. And I think we are, as human beings, coded to want, laughter or excitement or a smile, joy, right? All of us want that. I think somehow we've set up an economic structure which also then mirrors now our structure of, the way we converse, where I feel like we made it so hard for people just to embrace themselves. Because everyone is told you must hustle for it. Every Vogue cover I see, it makes me more and more uncomfortable with, who I am. It took me meeting a very famous actor in a club to realize that actually even like really famous actors are really insecure people. And it's sad, but I write about this, which is that actually it was the insecurity of that actor that made me realize that we are all very broken people, all of us in it together, irrespective of who's on like what magazine cover and who's not, right? And I think the moment you realize we're in it together, I think it makes it easier to embrace yourself. And I think the theme that's running through the book when it comes to love and liberation is not just liberation from the mating market, but liberation from this hustling to embrace yourself. I think all the women in the book are just trying to embrace themselves in the way they want to live life. And society makes it very hard, be it boyfriends, lovers, fathers, mothers, all of that, and they themselves. And I think each one of them is almost trying to, wrestle her way out of that dilemma. And I actually think at the end of the book, some people say the end of the book is very sad, but I actually think the end of the book is very hopeful, because I feel like almost all the women I follow do embrace themselves in one way or the other. And I think one example of them embracing themselves is just to be able to smile at Shah Rukh whenever they want, without friction, without judgment, just doing whenever they want to watch him, they can watch him. That's a way of embracing their own desires and their own pleasure, right? And their choices. And so I think to me, that's the really hard conversation around liberation and love, which is, and sometimes that path is very lonely, which is why it's India's lonely young women. That path to embrace yourself may require you to exit from things that will make it easier for you to socially settle, right? I mean, everywhere I go, I'm usually one of the very few single people at like events. All my friends are mostly coupled up. And then you have to bear the costs of a certain way you choose to live your life. And it's not a harsh cost compared to, I think, the kinds of lives people are living in our country. But then you have to put up with it. So I think that's the real liberation, which is that you have to sort of sit with yourself, embrace your own preferences, and ask yourself some of the preferences for the one. Where do they come from? I mean, for me, I realized thanks to this actor that my preference for the person I thought was the one, came from some very silly idea of making this person a status prize, right? And I think the more you take a step back, the better I think it is for all our well-being.
Also, I don't find that that chapter was particularly demonstrated any animosity towards your ex lover. It was never that. I think that was the fine line between, exploring who you were, but not at the cost of someone. I mean, belittling someone else.
Yeah.
So,
Saurabh, it's funny you should say that, because actually, I think the previous version, which was, I think, the original, that was actually an angry version.
I know.
Because I was younger. And
but it's fine.
At that time,
I remember reading a chapter and laughing my dash off, and I was smiling through and through. I was like, exactly, this should happen to this person. You should meet the next time and slap him.
No. And this is the thing. And, it's funny because I do have to sort of take a minute to say that, the reason I was able to write it, because I did tell the person concerned that I was writing it, and there were protections that I wanted to accord him, because, at the end of the day, this is a real person, and I don't want anyone feeling embarrassed, because at the end of the day, a book is not my life. I mean, the people in my life are my life. So I don't want to compromise that. And I am very grateful, actually. And I think both of us, the fact that I wrote it and then I think he read it, I think for both of us, it was a sort of moment of perhaps some reflection, because writing can do that, right? Like when you read it that way.
Absolutely.
And so I think maybe that's
my
why
reader has read it. I'm not sure what I have written, what my reader has read it.
Yeah, I wish you luck with that. And and what I will say though is that I think that's why the final version is much kinder. Also because, I'd moved on in life, like that sting, it didn't feel the same. So, you grow older, you also have other experiences, and people's lives move on. And now I'm actually very happy to say, I think, when the book's winning prizes, the person who is called the one is very happy about all the books, general. I know for a fact that he's got a copy and given it to someone. So yeah, like I think things move, right? Like they move in different ways. And so it's, I think this is actually perhaps one of the nice things about slow literature, when you take a long time to write something, which I know lots of people don't have the luxury to do. But when you do that, then I think you can see the same thing with a little bit of distance of time, right? Which is almost a cliche to say, but it's a very powerful cliche, because it is true that time just changes our spectrum of viewing. And I think that's very important.
Next up, how soon did you realize that these women you were talking to in these surveys were not at all interested in these questions and the tone they registered in the years? The next thing, like you though you have mentioned it previously in one of the answers, but I want you to know what was different in your approach. You share that it was accidental, but what was it like? What was this camaraderie and did you sense a repulsion for these questions, and you thought that might as well ask them to open about their desires, or was it just like it happened, or you observed something, them, talking about Shah Rukh, or maybe you just ask them like what movies you like, which you did have mentioned in the book as well. What was it like?
So. Right up in 2006, when I went first with my questionnaire, and I was very excited. I mean, initially people answered, but I could tell that the answers were very labored answers, because then when I asked someone later, she told me, well, that's because we're used to answering these questions, because these were women who were unionizing. They had mentioned, they had themselves done a collection of statistics of their own wages, working hours, presented it at that time to the Gujarat Labor Department. Some action, not enough action. So I think they were also themselves a bit disillusioned with this sort of, collecting data, because they felt like, okay, we'll collect the data and then what will happen, and Manju in Rampur says something very different. She says, you collect this data and then if we get the government, it's even scarier, because if you've seen the people in government, I don't want it. Like she says this in the book, I quote her. She said, I don't want anyone from the government to look at us because they're very scary people. And she said, I don't want, why would we do that? Anyway, and so I noticed that I think there was a boredom. I think boredom is the best way to put it. Just general, per se, like, again, girl with khadi, same question, okay. And so I realized at that point that this was, for me, I was young. I was not going to be getting the opportunity to come out and like talk to these people, be paid to do so as an RA, right? And in a way, at a very young age, it's a privilege, these jobs. And so I thought, well, I better make the most of them. At least let me try and talk to these people like they're just people, like all of us. And I realized, well, the only things that I tend to talk to people about is, I talk to people about films, books. And in this case, what was really common between all of us was Shah Rukh. And the moment I actually asked everyone who was their favorite actor, and I remember there was a pause. And then everyone just started giggling. There was this uncontrollable giggle. And by the way, it happens even now, Saurabh. I was in Nagpur recently for an event in a room full of like fairly posh ladies of Nagpur. I mentioned, who is your favorite actor? How many people like Shah Rukh? And there was like a room full of giggles. I mean, he just makes women giggle. Like they just immediately, there's this like grinning, giggling, like the energy just starts to shift. And I realized with the giggle, then I asked, okay, so like, why do you like him and what did you watch? Aapne kaun si film dekhi thi, or like, aapko kyun pasand hai? And immediately it's like, कितना अच्छा बोलता है, like ये देखा उस गाने में ये हुआ, उस गाने. And then in particular in Ahmedabad, actually the connection between housing finance and kuch kuch hota hai was like the first, I call it like my first breakthrough moment, because in the book I described, she actually uses a dialogue from kuch kuch hota hai to explain why women don't take on independent housing loans, even if the interest rate is lower than for men. And it's because they say, well, if a woman takes a loan, she'll have a house and not a home. It's a makan and it's not a ghar. Quoting kuch kuch hota hai. And I just thought, wow, this is just amazing. Like this man's films and his body of work, his persona suddenly seem to just allow people to express a lot of things about finance, families, love affairs, that I think maybe just in general language we couldn't. Because if I just sat down and I asked you, right, tell me about your love life, or tell me about like your jobs, you'll give me an answer, but it'll be a very coded, straight answer. And this just, I realized, I think in fact very early on I started to notice. And then the process, sort of one thing that I had decided very early on, and this came in fact because I was at that time, you remember this paper I told you, Ratna Sudarshan asked me to write. She said, why don't you write it? And I wrote this paper, and it was actually discussed with a few other feminists, because there used to be this group, they used to get together to discuss papers and books and so on. And Naila Kabir was part of it. And she's one of, the world's great feminist economists. And such a champion, I think, of this project of mine. And Ratna and her, I remember when we were going through this, the one thing they all said to me, and Ratna specifically said to me, and it's quoted in the book, she said, please don't ask people questions that you would not feel comfortable answering yourself, which I think is so important. And don't make people look like fools. I think those are the two, because there's a way sometimes when you start to talk about these things, then you can caricaturize, make people seem it looks odd, reads odd. I didn't want to do that. And so what I decided to do was, one principle I had was that I would never ask them direct questions about. So for example, Zahira lived, as you know, in a neighborhood which was adjacent to neighborhoods that were riot affected. I never asked her about riots. One of the things that was very clear was I wanted to talk about the films and then just generally whatever she wanted to share. But as you see, everything just it would just come up, right? Because she would talk about Shah Rukh songs, and then one day she starts telling me about, well, a Shah Rukh song played when at someone's house when the husband used to come to try and attack the woman, and then someone else is telling me, well, maybe that's just Zahira's story herself, but she'll never own up to it, right? Like, we don't know. but it's a story that she tells about violence. And all these things just slowly started to happen. The one thing I did not want to do is I didn't want to sort of go with a very clear set of patterns and themes. I did not want to do that. I wanted to sort of just let the conversations go where they did. And then I would diligently keep notes. And then if there were a few things where I wanted to come back and specifically ask, like I wanted to know if Meenal was married. So I went back. I wanted to know what was happening. Zahira's daughter. There I would ask. But my questions were always more to just fill in the blanks on certain trajectories that I just needed to fill in the blanks for. But broadly, what were the topics, right, that we would discuss, be it violence, be it sex, be it love, be it like how cute Shah Rukh is, that I just leaned into the flow of the conversation. And, the one thing, Saurabh, I do have to say, all people actually have very interesting things to say. This is true for anyone. It doesn't matter. Maybe even the most, bigoted right-wing nut, I wonder if they'll have interesting things to say. And in fact, sometimes I feel the problem with very harsh ideologies is that it blunts the things that interest you, right? Like, so because you're so obsessed with just talking about your ideology that you don't talk about other things. But actually, most people in our country, where honestly ideology is a luxury because most people are just trying to make ends meet, everyone has a philosophy, everyone has things to say. And if you just listen, be it like outside Mannat, be it anywhere, you may just following the conversations. I think this is called like ground up sociology, because instead of a framework, you let the framework emerge through the conversations. And that's what I did. So I never asked any targeted questions. The only targeted questions I did ask was, I wanted to know when they all had jobs, like how much were they earning? What was the structure of the job? I wanted to know a little bit about marital status and just, simple trajectories. But the rest of it, I think we just leaned in, which is why it's taken so long, because, then it takes a long time for then stories and themes to emerge.
Then after the introductory chapters, you begin the story of Vidya Shekhar. Was it deliberate to begin the maiden story of a woman navigating her way through life and making these everyday negotiations with this incidents in the cinema hall? And you write, it was not a shared singleness that forged a friendship in that dark hall. It was Shah Rukh. Also interesting was that you never, I think you were, I don't know why you say that you're not a journalist, but you have this quality that one admires in journalists, is you have a distance from your subject. Because then you are in awe of that subject. You also critique Vidya Shekhar a lot in this chapter. So yeah, these two things.
Yeah, we used to argue a lot, and I'm actually very fond of her. I think she's going to leave the country very soon. I have a feeling, given the way things are going. But we used to argue, and I think there was actually somebody else I was following as well from that class who used to have similar arguments, and she did not feel comfortable finally participating in the project. So she said, no, you can use bits of my story in that final composite piece, which is the elite composite. So she's one of the 80 people. And it broke my heart because I'd written an entire chapter, but then I couldn't use it. But Vidya she's a star. And she said, and I think one thing, the reason I started with that was two things. I see a lot of myself in her, because I do think that there was a lot of this concern about mobility, right? About people with privileges, but being very worried about not being able to compete with a certain kind of old moneyed property elite in Delhi, right? I can relate to that. And I knew that was actually a significant, having sort of finished the research amongst women of my class background, I knew that this was actually a very strong reason why people loved Shah Rukh, because it was such a strong script. And by the way, it's such a strong script in our current politics as well, right? Like, it's so dominant. And so I thought, I really wanted to sort of give space to that and really like pull it out. I wanted to put in the data on sort of, when we say middle class, like where is that middle class? And I really wanted to layer it with the different ways. Like I have this section called the 6 Maps of India. And I really wanted the reader right up in the beginning, because if you're a reader who's reading my book, you're probably a lot like Vidya. And I wanted the reader to know that you are this minority living in a certain bubble. I wanted all of that to be very clear right up in the beginning. And I felt like the conversations with her, be it her thoughts about caste, which I know so many people who have upper caste surnames bear, all these things I just wanted to be much more upfront with. So I think that was the reason to start with her. The other reason I wanted to start actually with the elites, I mean, that first section is elite women, is because I often find in a lot of nonfiction in India, like the elites are missing. I mean, either the elites are sort of there when you write about industrialists, right? Or like sort of big capital. But I think there's something very interesting going on in the Indian elite, because actually it's also funnily very precarious elite, because you have some people who actually have a lot of land and have amassed a lot of wealth. But as the data in the book tells you, actually inequality within the elites has also grown manifold, right? And there's something interesting going on there. And I think maybe from a more self-reflexive turn, I thought the first section to shed light on would be people like us. Like I wanted to sort of start with that, and then move down, the spectrum. So that was why. And I tried to critique her politics, because I don't agree with a lot of it. Although she's changed as well, as you can see towards the end of the chapter. She started to sort of switch, I think, where she thinks the country's going and so on. And she thinks I'm like too Bangali and too lefty, and she always gives me a hard time about it. But I felt that I think it's a great example of two people who kind of, we may not completely agree on lots of views, but we do get along. And she did, unlike another person, she actually said, no, you can, go ahead. And she read her story very carefully. And this is actually the thing about writing about the people who were elite, is they could all, and in a way it was good. It helped me very accountable, because they could all read the stories, they could fact check them, they could say, well, no, not this and no, not that. For women who couldn't read English and so on, I was relying on their daughters and also the professors and projects through which I met these women, just to make sure I was adhering to whatever norms of, making sure they knew the stories or reading it out to them, things like that. But it is different, right? But Vidya kept me very accountable. And but I'm very grateful that she allowed for, she wanted to participate. And I'm convinced, right now she says, anonymous and all of that. But I think when Shah Rukh comes out to do something, she'll be the first one to drop all this anonymity. Come on, screaming and shouting, saying, oh, I want to meet him. So anyway, yeah.
So I could actually see myself in gold and accountant so much. And accountant because of the geographical location, and also because of this strange navigate. I mean, thing that as a woman you have to navigate when it comes to your education. You almost have to fight for it every time. It is not. It is quite easy when you are in school, but it is very difficult when you have to fight for graduation and post graduation. I mean, the pressure about regarding marriage is. I know how precarious the situation is. And with gold, did two things with gold. I think first is she brings smile on your face instantly because of the way she is. She is savage, and she and the second thing is, deep down you see what a vulnerable person gold is, because innocently she's changing her all to fit, changing it all. Almost like if she sees herself in the mirror, I'm sure there must be multiple versions of gold she must be seeing. So I wanted to know from you, could you please tell me about how you connected with both of them and how did they react? Because they can fact check their stories. They can tell you what is good to go and what is not.
I have to first start by saying those two are the easiest to write about, because they're themselves because they're themselves are such great storytellers. Just generally, like there's so many stories. I never had to, I had no moment.
I know you because you're quoting them a lot in these chapters. You're quoting them a lot because they are the ones who are talking.
Yeah, they're very chatty women.
Yeah.
And the other thing actually, which I didn't want to hit people on the head with, but I think both of them said to me later, is that no one had ever thought that they were worthy of research. As in, like there's when we think about people who do research, like we often, particularly even in feminist research, it's never how many in-flight attendants do you know who feature in these surveys? Because they tend to have a certain lens, they tend to focus on certain kinds of people. On the
The
surface,
research
for
has
both
been
the gold,
extremist, either the
yeah,
top notch
perhaps,
or the bottom
yes,
notch,
or exactly, yes,
never the in
exactly,
between.
and never in between. And in fact, I feel like my book is only about people who are largely in between. And the interesting thing to me was that as a consequence, because they were so amused that I was approaching them as some, I think they just let loose. And I felt actually with both of them, I think my credentials, who I was, they'd kind of seen gold. In fact, I met at a nightclub in Delhi when I was with some people. And it was very rare for me to be at a nightclub, but I was with some people, and she kind of had a sense of my life as well, because both of them, and the accountant I met when I was working at the Delhi Secretariat, because she was there as well. And both of them knew me as just also a person in life. Vidya, actually, I met more because I once met her in the hall, and then we decided we would follow up on, because I told her I was thinking of doing this book and so on and so forth. She knew that. These two actually knew me when I was I was still not sure whether I was going to open up the book, to sort of other, but they were in my life, and they knew me from a professional point of view, and they knew my life. So as a consequence, I think there was a lot of back and forth generally, like they Gold knew very well. The girl who's called Gold knew very well what was going on in my personal life. So there was a kind of openness to it. And I just felt that I wanted to write the two of them. One, I wanted to do justice to how much of themselves they had shared with me, because they really had shared a lot. And they had shared a lot selflessly, not because at that time it wasn't clear. They had just done it in the space of solidarity, because at that point it wasn't even friendship. We became friends later. And I wouldn't even think with the accountant I'm still friends. I think it's somewhat different. I would still say Gold and I are perhaps friends. But it was interesting that when that was happening, I wanted to do justice to all that they had told me, and that they were and they were more than happy for it to be sort of recorded and shared and all of that, because they couldn't understand. In fact, now they find it really strange that people are reading the book. They still think it's odd, because they can't quite understand why this is of interest to anyone, because to them their lives are very ordinary. But that's what I really wanted the writing to convey, the extraordinariness within the ordinary. Like I really felt, I don't think there's anything ordinary about any of the women I've written about. But in particular, these two women, because they are part of a landscape we tend to take for granted, women in jobs in aviation who like look a certain way and, party and go out. Like there's nothing, these are usually like the background dancers, right? To like the big stars. Or a woman in government, you'll never know her because, she does the accounts in government. There's nothing on the surface remarkable about what she's doing. She's not a big achiever in government. But I really wanted the reader. I worked very hard, in fact, on that section, because I call them Bazigars, because I really wanted the reader to know how much these women had gambled in their lives. Gambled away with conformity. Essentially, they had said we are going to gamble away all the comforts of conformity, because there is a kind of passion in self pursuit that they wanted to embark on. And I really wanted the reader to understand how these women are actually revolutionaries. And I really hope, the one thing I really hope when you walk out of that section in the book, you realize that actually so many women around us who just have jobs and are out and about, each one of them is probably a Gold or an accountant. We don't realize it. You scratch the surface and you realize these stories actually are hold very similar for lots of people. And then Shah Rukh helped a lot, because both of them, and the thing is, these two women use Shah Rukh very differently than the other women in the book. Because you can see, because I think they are really fighting against a very traditional structure, and they're really fighting. And they use him as almost self-help guru coach. So for example, when the accountant tells me about Shah Rukh, and I mentioned that she has this scrapbook, and she can almost tell you which exam was happening when Shah Rukh's this film came out. So she correlated, her career, her exams, her marriage struggles, all of that with him, because anytime she felt sad or she wanted escape, she would look to him, and she remembered that very well. And so it just then made it easier, right, to make the connections, like particularly films like Om Shanti Om and all of that, right? She used to rely on that. And Gold, of course, in the middle of all this heartache, was relying on him. When I was in Boston, I mean, she was watching these documentaries and she was watching all this stuff, and I discovered things about him that I didn't know through her. And it's interesting because at that time I thought, oh, she was just telling me about things she was watching. But now, later, when I looked at the notes and when I started to write it up, I realized actually there was this emotional trajectory, right, that you could almost map out. And yeah, I think honestly, those two women were the easiest to write, in that they shared so much of themselves because they just couldn't understand that this would be interesting to anyone, and they were very happy. But at the same time, it was also the hardest to write because I knew then the standards were very high. I set my standards very high for that section because I really wanted, as I said, the radical acts that we kind of dismiss and ignore. I really think these two women capture those. And I really hope that when people walk away, they just, as I said to you, they just realize that the woman next to you is Gold, or the woman next to you is the accountant. And I think it's really important to I wanted to convey that.
What is in that fandom that, as an economic principle, that you think would offer that other metrics don't? And do you think that you will successfully be able to employ fandom as a tool to understand economic developments, and maybe it can become a metric some other day? Very futuristic, but still.
I've been presenting at economics departments. I did it was a wonderful talk. I was at Azim Premji University there, economics department. They'd invited me, and we were talking about the economics of fun and fandom. And in fact, they were saying that, yeah, like, why don't we think about studying these things in deeper ways? So who knows, let's see. I realized actually very early on, sometime in 2007, that fandom, what I thought was just some silly activity of girls giggling at some guy, especially in film, even myself. I realized that actually it was this really unusual prism to describe people's purchasing power. Could you go out and buy a cassette? Many of the women couldn't even go out of the house, let alone go to the cassette shop. Many of the women said when they'd go to a cassette shop, they'd be judged for asking for the cassette. The others would say that we don't have the money to ask for a cassette. The third would say, I have to beg with my brother to get me to watch a Shah Rukh film because it's unsafe to go to a cinema hall alone. These are connections that honestly I didn't make till I sort of sat back in 2007-8 after that first round of like the euphoria, just the first round of being in the field or whatever. And so, yes, I actually think there's a lot that we can unpack through what we could call fun, leisure goods. And economists do study those. I'm thinking of what I will do next, and I think it'll have some themes around those, and we'll see. So, yes, I hope that one thing I really hope with the book is, I got very irritated initially when, some people would say, oh, but this is just a silly book about girls gushing about Shah Rukh Khan, which is fine. That's okay. I mean, everyone will read it their own way. But actually, at some level, I really want people to retire that idea that actually there is so much you can learn from things on the surface that don't seem serious in that very sort of, Brahminical sense of what is serious. That I felt that suddenly this was a very different research method. I was presenting at Jamia Millia University, and they told me that they are putting this in their research methods class. And I know it's in the research methods class for other universities now as well, because you can learn a lot, and very rigorous, serious good work, solid work you could do, but you could enter into it very differently. And I think if we actually listen to people as opposed to forcing our framework onto people, I think our research might come out, particularly the qualitative research we do can come out to be much more rich, I feel. And I think the book is just an experiment in that direction.
And anyway, quantitative research also needs a context. You have to have stories to describe what the data is.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's this kind of statistical fetishism that's very
Yeah.
typical of like very masculine cultures, right? Like data, aa gaya, like data do. And of course, the funny thing
Yeah.
is like right now we are in a country which is barely producing data. I mean, the last time we had a
Or hiding
consumption
it if
round
it
was,
is.
yeah, like I mean, it's just not available. But leaving that aside, you know, I'm a big, I mean, and the book is, if it's a love letter to Shah Rukh and it's a love letter to the women of India, it's also a love letter to statisticians. And I say this in the acknowledgements, which is that none of the things I say in the book would be possible without the hard work. So many random faceless surveyors, which is why one of the chapters is called Surveyor, ends up doing in collecting data. It's very difficult work. It's hard work to do, to go out. I know I've done it, and I've done it for a very short period of time. For people who do this for their living, it's very difficult. But at the same time, I feel that you can convey the statistics, but I think sometimes the statistics tend to reduce the sort of granularity and the texture of what is happening. And I don't think that, you know, there are two ways that statistics are important to convey reality, right? One is, you know, like that world of policy and technocracy and decision making. I live in that world, and I know data is very important there, of course. But there's a different world which is about educating ourselves as societies, you know, as just civic participants about the lives of others, right? For social action, for movement, for public action, for politics. And I think their statistics will always fall short because you want feeling. It's actually feeling that moves people. It's rarely data. And I really wanted to write the story of the economy from that sense of feeling, and a sense of feeling that doesn't come from just the data, but you need to know the data very well to communicate its stories well as well. So to me, it's very much an ode to what statistics can do, but statistics complemented with the texture of the messiness of real life, because I think that is what conveys feelings. And if we don't feel strongly about the women and the economy agenda, and only stories will get you, I think, to feel that strongly, then we won't see action. So I think that was the pursuit with this.
Next up is Zahir. It was Zahira's daughter, right? Who said that
Neenal.
Priyanka Chopra. Yeah,
No,
yeah,
that's Sandhya's daughter.
that's
Sandhya's
Sandhya.
daughter said Priyanka
Yeah.
Chopra. Yeah.
So, are we? I mean, should we expect another book about
No,
Priyanka
I'm
Chopra
I'm
and her
done.
fans?
I no, I love Priyanka Chopra. I am one of her fans. I no, I think there's only one person who I wanted to sort of anchor a framework around, and it happened partly by accident and partly just the love that all of us seem to have for him, and he's the man behind that poster. I don't think I'll be venturing into the world of icons any further. I have other plans. There's something else longitudinally that I want to do. But have you read? You should read Priyanka Chopra's her own book. It's a fabulous book. I mean, given
I
the
haven't
constraints
written.
of what she does, is interesting. I read it. Given the constraints of, you know, someone who's a public icon, she does talk about. She's quite open about things that happen in the industry. So I thought it was interesting. And yeah, I'm sure someone else hopefully will write a book about, you know, our female icons. They deserve it.
And I mean, as I said that there was no particular animosity regarding anyone we were telling these stories, but I loved when you bash ground reality uncles. I want you to
Yeah,
uh,
I'm going to
say
get into
something
so
about
much
them.
trouble.
Tell them something that what they should
Uh,
need to do.
I don't know. I have nothing. No, they won't take me seriously enough to listen to me iota.
I pity them.
No, it's okay. I don't pity them. I think they're leading very happy lives. You know, part of, you know, this goes back to what you were asking about liberation, right? I don't think you can be a woman in Delhi, in particular Delhi, who works in sort of the policy development, social work as well, circuit, and constantly be surrounded by men who will talk over you, who may not know anything but will like claim to know, and will also judge you for your claims of knowledge constantly. I have met through my career, and here's the really interesting thing: these people that I've met very rarely I mean, I work for the World Bank, and I have to actually say that I've never met anyone like that within my office. Most of the people I work in my office are like wonderful women. I work with some terrific technocrats and people, and even in government, I don't meet these people. I have to be honest with you. I think there was a time in government they used to be there, but I think things have really shifted, even in government, because I deal with government a lot. Actually, where you see these people is like this think tank, like the broader, there's like a culture of like I think the people who are like the talking heads, the sort of, this the thinking population, the public intellectuals, all of that.
In those parties,
I'm
especially
so
in those
tired.
parties.
Actually, funny, I recently wrote something, and someone, I will not name the person, but he's a very revered, wonderful public intellectual, like one of my favorite people who writes in India. He wrote to me saying, you should stop going to parties. He said, you go, you're just going to get upset because people never. He said he'd learned long time ago that there's no point in going to Delhi parties. He said, you shouldn't go. So I said, I think you may be on to something. But I told him, I need to go to parties for research because
that's material.
I can't know what's going on. Yeah, I know. I want to know what's going on. But anyway, but I do think that in the book I want, because actually that conversation that I describe is it's a fictional one. I've had versions of that conversation with actually like a very serious historian at an event where there were other people who just weren't interested in anything I had to say because, for all those sort of complex reasons why people like me are categorized as being like, you say these things and all of that. And so I felt like the best way to get the reader for the numbers to come alive, because actually that section is very dry. That section is about numbers. And I thought, one of the things I really realized was I kept finding myself constantly talking about numbers at these parties because that's all I do. And so I thought, well, the best way for the reader also perhaps to be introduced to this was to go through the rigmarole of that conversation, of what happens, like the kinds of questions. Because I also anticipated some questions that people would have on the data. Is it accurate? Does it miss someone? So on and so forth. So I thought this was a good way to do it. So that way the statistics are interesting, but it's also conversational. And I'm also then able to at least like say what I want to say about this kind of ecosystem, which I do think that there's an effort now to try and change it, but it's still there, and I think it'll take a while for things to really shift. But I think it's important. It's important for people, particularly people like me who have the privilege of writing, and I know, I can write something like this and still have a job and, all of those things, to do that, because you have to call it out. You have to call it out for what it is. I mean, it's not an egregious crime, but it's something that we need to talk about. And I don't know if you saw recently, there was a study that came out of the US about the share of women's voices on economic panels, like, panels reviewing things and all kinds of journals and all of that. And women's representation still remains really low. Like when men assert more confident views, all of that is still statistically true. So I think given that context, it's important for women to assert space and for us to then, I often find instead of outrage, humor is a better way to address some of these things. And so I thought that that section was a way for me to sort of try and do these three things together. And then hopefully, I'm glad at least the data is still clear to people who read it. Nobody comes out scratching their head. Yeah.
So thank you, Shrayana, for writing this book. Thank you for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Saurabh. This was such a pleasure. Please stay well, and I wish you the best with everything. And I look forward to your writing as well.